A few preliminaries. The March 2012 killing of a rabbi and 3 children at a Jewish school in Toulouse. The emergence of the neo-Nazi Jobbik Party in Hungary and Golden Dawn in Greece as serious and violent political forces. Last summer's murder of 4 visitors to the Jewish Museum of Belgium, followed by the refusal of an Antwerp physician to treat a Jewish woman with a fractured rib. The killing of 4 Jews at the kosher supermarket in Paris in January of this year, followed by the killing of a Jewish guard outside a synagogue in Copenhagen in February. These are but a few of the alarming anti-Semitic events of the past several years that make this panel so very necessary. France is currently a hotspot for anti-Semitic activities. Last year, 851 anti-Semitic acts were registered, compared with 423 in 2013. In Great Britain, according to a recent study, there were twice as many anti-Semitic incidents in 2014 compared to 2013. Those are very disturbing and dramatic concerns for us. Last month, Ambassador Ronald Lauder, the president of the World Jewish Congress, stood beside the mass grave of Bergen-Belsen and said, 70 years ago, Jews learned the hard way that when someone says they want to kill you, you better take them seriously. We've gone down the same road before in my lifetime, and we are standing on the result. To be here at Bergen-Belsen and shout against the past while doing nothing about the present is not just wrong, it is outrageous and it is immoral. The World Jewish Congress has been at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism in all its various manifestations throughout the past 69 years, and remains committed to assisting and supporting each of 100 member communities as they confront this oldest of evils. But neither we nor they can do so in a vacuum. Our goal this afternoon is to examine various dimensions of this enormous and critical challenge. We will now hear from 6 outstanding individuals, each with a unique expertise and perspective on this, for the Jewish people, existentialist issue. In alphabetical order. Robert Ejnes is director of CRIF, Conseil représentatif des institutions juives de France. As director of the umbrella organization of French Jewish communities, Robert is at the helm of the largest Jewish community in Europe, but one facing a record exodus amid rising levels of violent anti-Semitism. He has spent 18 years as a board member at the European Council of Jewish Communities. Mark Gardner is Director of Communication at the Community Security Trust. He joined the CST in 1989, first serving as a researcher and then as Director of Research. He was commended for helping to lead police communication with all of London's minority communities during the Nazi nail bombing campaign of 1999. Fulvio Martuscello is a member of the European Parliament, representing the Forza Italia party, and chairman of the European Parliament delegation for relations with Israel. He has a long career in public service. Earlier this year, following the national elections in Israel, Mr. Martuscello warned the governments of the European Union not to isolate Israel, declaring that, and I quote, "It is on the isolation of Israel that religious fanaticism grows." Gillian Merron is Chief Executive at the Board of Deputies of British Schools. A minister under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, she served as a member of Parliament for Lincoln until she left the world of politics in 2010. She joined the board of Liberal Judaism and became Vice President of the Jewish Leadership Council before taking over the board in 2014. Maajid Nawaz is the founder and chairman of Quilliam. He is a former member of the radical Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, speaking and recruiting for the group. In 2001, this association led to his arrest in Egypt, where he was interrogated and subsequently jailed. On leaving prison, he renounced his membership and has since campaigned against extremism, co-founding Quilliam in 2008, and becoming one of the UK's foremost critics of radical or extremist Islamism. Sally Seeley is the Department of Communities and Local Government's lead official on tackling hate crime and all other forms of hatred and intolerance. The DCLG is responsible for preventing hate crime before it happens. She also coordinates the UK government's response to anti-Semitism and is part of the cross-government working group on tackling anti-Semitism, which is made up of the chief executive of the Board of Deputies, the CST, and the Jewish Leadership Council. With this introduction, I would like to ask each of the panelists to make some introductory comments and remarks before we can have a discussion among us. I think we'll do it in alphabet. Robert.
Okay, thank you very much. Being at the head of the TIF, which is the largest organization of the largest Jewish community in Europe, we also, unfortunately, have experience in anti-Semitism. When I met with Elie Wiesel a little more than a year ago, I asked him, what do you think about the rise of anti-Semitism in France? So he said that France has always been anti-Semitic. So I said that the number of acts has increased tremendously in the past year. And so, is the Jewish population worried about the situation? So I had to think a minute, and I said, I think they are. Then he said, then the situation is bad, the situation is worrying for the Jews of France. Menachem just said, remember the killing that happened in the Jewish community in France. And up to 2006, there was anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitic act, but people said, okay, but there hasn't been any casualty, and there had been no casualty since World War II. But in 2006, we had the story of Ilan Halimi. You may remember this young man who was abducted because he was Jewish and tortured for 21 days before he was killed. And at that time, the French Jews realized that danger was at the door. In 2012, in Toulouse, in a Jewish school, as you just reminded us, somebody killed a father and two children and the daughter of the school director at blank point. And then in 2014, a Frenchman born in France, educated in the French schools, went and killed people in the museum in Brussels. And finally, in 2015, after the Charlie Hebdo killing, somebody got into a Jewish store on a Friday, and it was not, and with the intention, of course, to kill Jews. So we've had a long story of casualty, a long story of death in the Jewish community of France. And this is not isolated acts like people would want to view it very often, but it comes into an ambiance in the whole country. Like in January of 2014, in a demonstration called Day of Wrath, people started in the street we didn't see it coming, started shouting in the street, death to Jews. Jews, France is not yours. And this came really as a surprise. But at the same time, and a little later, last year in July, during the demonstration, people demonstrating for Palestinians in Gaza. The same thing happened again, and the demonstrations ended with march on synagogues, on 8 different synagogues in a period of a few weeks. And this comes into the environment of anti-Semitic speech. You may have heard about Gardner, former comics that started to be anti-Semitic and whose speech started to be radicalized against Jews and negating Holocaust. But he's not alone. We have others like him, like Soal. And we have like this a few sets of population who are very keen on being anti-Semitic, and I'll speak a little bit in a moment about who they are. But basically, starting in October 2000, the date is very precise. It's the very date when you remember Muhammad al-Dura, this little kid, pretentiously killed by the Israeli forces, which was never proved. It was proved it was a forged report. But anyways, from that day that he appeared on a full page of the Sunday newspaper, the level of anti-Semitism in France raised drastically, and the number of anti-Semitic acts boomed terribly from the past years, where it used to be only 200 cases a year, and it went up to 800 and more, and last year it went down and up, and last year it doubled from the previous year, and the anti-Semitic acts in France are more and more violent. And this comes to the present situation where BDS is starting to be a real issue. We talked about it a little bit this morning. A real issue for not only for Israel but also for anti-Semitism. We made a study last year that was made from an independent think tank called Fondapol on anti-Semitism, which found that basically the French society is not very anti-Semitic. It's not more anti-Semitic as a whole as it had been, and it had been measured in previous years. Although they found that 3 populations were much more anti-Semitic than others and responded much more favorably to anti-Semitic ideas than the rest of the people. One population is the extreme right. Historically, this is the same old story of the extreme right being against the Jews for religious, political, hate reasons. They're not really violent, but they like to propagate ideas of anti-Semitism. The second group is the far left, the extreme left. Extreme left is more dangerous because they're not anti-Semitic. They're anti-Zionist. And they theorize the story of being anti-Zionist, not being against the Israeli government. I have to go faster. Not being against the Israeli government, but being against the existence of Israel, and it always goes to the Jews. I'll go very quickly. The third group is the Muslims in France, where they found that basically 43% of the Muslim population in France responds to anti-Semitic ideas. To make it short for the end, we are in a paradoxical situation because the French government is doing all it can to fight anti-Semitism. From the president to the prime minister to the government, they gave a lot of credentials to fighting anti-Semitism and combat it. But as you said, Jews are leaving France because they feel insecure, and we will discuss it later, so I'll leave the speech to somebody.
Thank you very much. Because Robert traveled a fair distance to get here today, I was a little more given few about it. We're going to ask these speakers to keep the opening comments to about 5 minutes or so each. Mark Gardner.
Thank you, Matt. I think we have a tendency to talk about anti-Semitism these days as if we're on an inexorable trajectory in which every year is worse than the last. And it's when we discuss that trajectory that we get to an end point of saying, well, so what's the future of European Jews? And Moshe Kantor rightly asks for a normative future for European Jewry. Okay, we can philosophize as to what normative might look like in the European Jewish sense, but to discuss how to reach a situation in which Jews can live a normative life, however you might choose to define that, and you set that against the trajectory that we seem to be on, it's very hard to see how you roll things back. In your introductory remarks, you quite rightly said that CST recorded well over 1,000 anti-Semitic incidents, hate crimes. Last year, that was the worst year that we'd ever recorded. Nevertheless, what gets forgotten when we have this conversation is that in 2013, we had the lowest figure since 2004. Actually, in 2013, we had 3 more incidents than we had in 2004. And when we brought out the 2013 statistics, of course, the media jumped on it and said, great, so anti-Semitism seems to be on the decline. Not really a problem anymore. So how do we measure anti-Semitism? How do we discern? Is it on an inexorable trajectory, or is it not? And when we measure anti-Semitism, there are various ways of doing it, and I think we have to be very mindful of the accuracy of those methodologies and how they may be cross-compared in and of themselves, and also with each other. But I think there are some generalities that we can quite easily identify. Firstly, when there's a war in the Middle East, the number of anti-Semitic incidents, certainly in the UK, will multiply by 300%. What that means is that whereas most weeks, most months, most years, in Britain at least, you can happily live a Jewish life without being too bothered about anti-Semitism for most of us. Actually, do you know what? When the number of hate crimes triples, that becomes far harder. And also the number of hate crimes is occurring against the backdrop of people feeling very pressured about a situation in the Middle East, demonstrations, boycott activities, etc., etc. What I've referred to previously as the pressure cooker. There are all sorts of things that contribute to the heat that bubbles away on the pressure cooker. Some years, if there isn't a war in the Middle East, the lid stays on the pressure cooker. Other years, if there is a trigger event, as criminologists call these things, if there is a trigger event, the lid blows off the pressure cooker. The longer the trigger event goes on for, the more incidents there will be. That's why we had more incidents last year, because last year's war between Israel and one of its neighbours lasted a lot longer than they usually do. I think if we were to look at the 2009 conflict, Operation Cast Lead, do you know what? Actually, we felt that things were a lot worse in the UK than they were last year. Statistically, not as bad, but the war lasted about half the time, maybe a little bit less. This time around, the anti-Semitism within the anti-Israel demonstrations was very, very marginal. You really, really had to look to find it. In the UK situation, I appreciate that the images that we watched on YouTube, because of social media, we get dragged in and out to a European context. We see demonstrations in France and Germany and Holland and elsewhere with overt anti-Semitism. We see frightening scenes outside French synagogues. And we feel, because of the impact of social media, as if we are also going into that. And I think, to be honest, that there is an accuracy in that, and there's a greater perception of what's going on, and it is right. We are at the mercy of these currents. Another way to measure anti-Semitism is by surveys. What do people think about Jews? In this regard, surveys in English-speaking nations basically show that between 5 and 10% of the population harbour attitudes that you might say were anti-Semitic. 5 to 10%. Is that so many people that we ought to be concerned for our future, or isn't it? In France and Germany, it's sometimes between 10 and 20%, perhaps. Anti-Semitism in the UK, at least, has never been really a political force, not in the way that historically we've seen it in France and elsewhere on the European continent. When we, again, look into these statistics of perception, we have to be aware of what they don't pick up. 7% of the UK population last time around seemed to be anti-Semitic. The problem, however, that I say to journalists, French Jews are not leaving France because of the number of people who are voting for the Front National. They're leaving France because of what they see and the direction of travel from their fellow French citizens, French Muslim citizens. And that is picked up in these polling statistics because the population is not large enough. So I think we have to look at it, look at the things that cause these things. What do the opinion surveys tell us, and what can they actually measure, and who is it that actually needs to be surveyed, because they give the qualitative kick to the anti-Semitism. And how many terrorist attacks are there? Because the number of terrorist attacks and the ongoing pressure of terrorist attacks is really what I would suggest makes life for European Jews intolerable at times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin.
First of all, we must have the courage of the truth. Today, the United Nations accused Israel of war crimes. I consider this work very partial and not really true. Israel defends itself from an organization that has in its charter the destruction of Israel. We have to say it. The role of the chair of the delegation in the State of Israel, the European Parliament, is first of all to be independent, to be the capacity to develop good relation with the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset. In this sense, the most important thing of the delegation is to discuss the relation between the European Union and Israel. The current situation of anti-Semitism in Europe is so delicate and dangerous that I personally took the challenge of discussing this issue in delegation meetings. Also because while was demonstrating against Israel with blame the European Jews in general, anti-Semitism will always on the basis of those bashing Israel. My role as chair is to create and develop channels of communication between the European Union and Israel, officially in order to reinforce this relation in both ways. I strongly believe that the European Union and member states are giving the answer to the problem of modern anti-Semitism, even if they are not enough to fight. I understand why European Jews don't feel confused, and it's our duty, the duty of the European Union, to intervene in order to give the sense of safety to all its citizens. There are several solutions to fight this greed, and it's here where the institutions have a fundamental role to create those solutions. My role is to push the European Parliament and to put political pressure on the other institutions. But the cooperation with the State of Israel is fundamental for a practical and effective answer to this issue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gillian Merron.
I'm Gillian Merron, Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and I want to speak therefore from a perspective of the representative body of the Jewish community in Britain. And I see this issue perhaps divided into four main areas. The first one being the general context of the United Kingdom, where anti-Semitism is something to be concerned about, but as we have already heard, is generally better than elsewhere in Europe. Secondly, we see a shift of the threat and where it's coming from, but it's not the old position of just the far right, but is indeed the far left and also the Islamists, and that represents a big change for us. Thirdly, the dimension of the link between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, the blurring of the line, as we might call it, and that is a tricky one for us, and I'm sure we'll discuss that later. And fourthly, the other area I would want to just refer to is the response of the political parties. So, first of all, the general context, and that anti-Semitism in the UK has traditionally been lower than in many European countries. That that is, of course, some relation to the fact we have a very different history and a very different experience in the world, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. As Mark said earlier, there are a number of surveys that clearly show that whilst anti-Semitism is an issue in terms of attitudes in Britain, that numerically that isn't as high as elsewhere. This isn't to suggest that we should be complacent, because when I look particularly at something like the Anti-Defamation League survey, I'm interested, they ask their 11 questions around basic stereotypes of Jews. Do you think or do you not think that Jews have too much power in the financial world, in the political world? So clearly these ideas and others still have a lot of traction. We've also heard about the link between the spike in anti-Semitism and wars involving Israel, and that, I believe, that link is firmly established. And my last point on the general context is that it's not just about the actuality of anti-Semitism and attacks and words and abuse, it's also the fear of it. And I think that that is something that's harder to measure, but is all pervasive, particularly at certain times, and we need to think about that. The other aspect I referred to, my second aspect, the shift of the threat. It's not just the far right anymore, but has now shifted. Whilst the UK has seen lower levels than France and Belgium, nevertheless for me, having similar demographics and issues with significant numbers of people joining jihadi movements such as ISIS gives us in the UK real cause for concern, and is a real challenge, I believe, for our government and the relevant departments. And undoubtedly that the link between ISIS, Syria, the jihadist ideology and attacks on places like the Jewish Museum in Brussels and the attacks in France say to me that in the UK we have to be on our guard and to take proactive steps. My third point, the blurred line as I referred it to, the anti-Semitism, is it anti-Semitism, is it anti-Zionism? I think that is challenging for us, because the truth is, to criticise a government's policies, whether it's Israel or Britain or any country, is acceptable. Of course it must be. But what is disturbing is what we witness, and that's one where the word Jew is replaced with the word Israeli, that they become interchangeable. That when we hear anti-Semitic ideas and thoughts thrown around applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that leads us to a point where there's a question about the very right of Israel to exist. I believe that's where the line is more than blurred, the line has been crossed. And indeed, as we all know, is demonstrated very much through actions like boycotts, like divestment, and calls for Israel to be delegitimised. And my fourth and final area here, I talked about the political response. Undoubtedly, as a community, we are harmed by the government's response. We saw that at a Board of Deputies meeting where the Home Secretary Theresa May came very quickly after the attacks in France and in Copenhagen in order to express solidarity with the Jewish community and to make it quite clear that anti-Semitism has no place in today's Britain. And that has been extended across all parties and demonstrated, I believe, by support for things such as excellent work like the all-party parliamentary group's work on anti-Semitism, the support for the all-party parliamentary group on British Jews that the Board of Deputies support, and I'm sure Sally will go on to talk about the anti-Semitism cross-government working group on which a number of us do sit. And of course, we must never forget that in Britain we have an institutional political rejection of anti-Semitism, and I think that sets us apart from other times and other places. What I would say to you, just as a closing wind-up thought, on the 4th of July we have potentially, very potentially, a demonstration by a neo-Nazi group in Golders Green protesting against what they call the Jewification of Golders Green. What has been our response? It has been, I think, one, to tackle this head-on where we can, to challenge, to call upon agencies, including the police, to act as they can Act Best, but it's also been a cross-communal response, not just an issue for the Jewish community, but where all communities in Golders Green have come together and indeed formed a campaign called Golders Green Together. So we have been positive about what it means to be Jewish and proud to be Jewish and proud to stand as one of the communities, a key one in Golders Green and of course in Britain. And for me, that mix of challenge, pride and indeed being positive is absolutely the right way to take this on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nawaz.
Thank you. My name is Maajid Nawaz. I'm founding chairman of WIGAN, and my thanks go to the Jewish News for inviting me and everyone here, putting on this conference with Vital as well. I won't take too long, considering this is a rather large panel, probably one of the largest panels I've sat on actually. But I do want to point to 3 points for you as food for thought. The first is what I recently mentioned in Washington DC at the AJC Global Forum, and that is what I call the triple threat, and it's been alluded to in some of the remarks by the previous speakers. And the triple threat that's facing European Jewry is in terms of anti-Semitism, is from the far left and the far right and Islamist extremists. The way in which that triple threat manifests itself depends upon on a country-to-country basis. So in the United Kingdom, an alliance has long stood between those on the fringe or far left and the Islamist extremists who share absolutely nothing in common when it comes to social policies. But what they do agree is, in foreign policy, their disproportionate focus and obsession with every minutiae of action that the State of Israel takes. So it's become common as a result to see this alliance between the far left and the Islamist extreme in the United Kingdom focus on BDS as a campaign, yet remain completely silent, whilst Amnesty International adopted prisoner of conscience Raif Badawi is being lashed as we speak in Saudi Arabia for having set up a blog. And so this disproportionate focus on the foreign policy of on just one country from a foreign policy perspective is how it manifests in the United Kingdom between the Islamists and the far left. In France and in other European countries, it manifests in a different way, and that alliance is between the far right and the Islamist extreme on domestic rather than foreign policies. And so where the far right and the Islamist extreme in France could agree was on their common hatred of the presence of the Jewish communities in France. And so on a couple of occasions, they even attempted to organize joint demonstrations, believe it or not, together. So that's what I call the triple threat. It behooves us to recognize, where we are uncomfortable to say so, that in fact the common denomination between all of these across Europe is the presence of the Islamist extremists. It also behooves us to move to the second point now that I would like to comment on. It behooves us to recognize that though anti-Muslim hatred is a concern in the United Kingdom and is a concern across Europe, proportionately, statistically, anti-Semitic incidents dwarf those of anti-Muslim hatred in the United Kingdom. We have to recognize that. We also have to recognize that proportionately, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United Kingdom are disproportionately conducted by Islamist extremists. All of these are statistics that the CST and others monitor regularly. And therefore, these are uncomfortable truths that I can say sitting here without fear of being called a racist or an Islamophobe, though I'm called both regularly, which means it's even more uncomfortable for people such as yourselves to say the following. And this is why it's so important for us to start saying the unspeakable. I call it the Voldemort effect, if anyone's read the Harry Potter books. He who must not be named. This culture has emerged, led by President Obama himself, where instead of naming the Islamist ideology, you refer to it as the extremist ideology without being able to call it by what it is. Yeah. And the danger there, of course, is it increases the hysteria, as not being able to name Voldemort did in the Harry Potter books. Not being able to name the enemy makes us fear it even more. And with that fear comes even more irrationality, and therefore, by definition, even more anti-Muslim hatred. And so I call for an open and frank conversation on these issues, not least because Muslims, and people like myself, are the first victims of the theocratic fascist ideology of Islamism. Only yesterday, a mosque in Bradford had infidel Shiites daubed on its wall probably by people that subscribe to the austere literalist Wahhabi interpretation, crossing over with the Islamist view of Islam. And so not least because Muslims are the primary victims of Islamistic extremism when it does come to power, because it tends to come to power in Muslim-majority countries where women, minority sects, dissenting and liberal Muslim voices, gay Muslims, and all forms of other minorities are the first victims, whether that's because they're thrown off tall buildings, whether that's because they're lashed, or whether that's because they're forced to cover themselves from head to toe. And so we have to, on behalf of those minorities within the minorities, have the courage to identify that triple threat for what it is, and recognise that a disproportionate player in that triple threat is Islamist extremism if we stand a chance of beginning to be able to challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The last person to speak, I'm thinking, have I got anything left to say? But I think I'll focus on the response of the UK government. I mean, I think the UK government has acknowledged last year, particularly during the situation in Gaza, the conflict, what happened with the effect on the Jewish community in this country. As Mark said, we saw an increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents. And what's our response been to that? I mean, I think the government has come up very clearly, it's made a number of statements, but words often are not enough, and it's about what are the practical things that we have done over the last year to try and make a difference. And I think the first thing that everybody's been concerned about is the security issue, is the security of the Jewish community, of Jewish faith schools, of synagogues, of Jewish community buildings. And the government has put aside over £10 million, which are new money, which is basically to secure those buildings. And particularly, back in 2010, the government only looked at state-aided, state faith schools, and now the money is actually for all faith schools, independent faith schools as well. So I think that's an issue that was of particular concern to the Jewish community in light of what happened in Paris and Copenhagen earlier this year. So other things that, it's been very, very clear that we're very lucky in the UK that we've got cross-party support for addressing anti-Semitism. There's been 2 cross-party inquiries with innumerable recommendations that the group that CST, the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council sits on with government. And we go through those recommendations regularly to make sure that we cover them. And the recommendations cover everything from online hatred to security issue, to issues around restorative justice and a whole range of other issues. So I think one of the big issues for us, which has been mentioned earlier today as well, is the sort of chilling factor that the boycott and disinvestment campaign has on the Jewish community in the UK. And I think the government has been extremely clear that obviously we don't support any kind of boycott. That doesn't necessarily make a difference to the Jewish community on the ground, because you still feel that chilling effect. And it's about the kind of things that we can do. We've been out to a number of universities to try and talk to students, to try and encourage them to have debate rather than screaming down speakers. There also is a big issue on university campuses, and particularly around hate speakers coming into the country. The Home Secretary, this Home Secretary has excluded more hate speakers than any other Home Secretary before the time. The person that you mentioned, Ejnes is excluded from this country. That doesn't prevent him being in by satellite. That is a big issue. But I think the message is very clear that hate speakers are not welcome in the UK. And we have excluded many of them over the years. I think the other important thing is our approach to tackling anti-Semitism. It's a cross-government approach. It's not just down to one department, but it's down to a whole range of departments across government. And we do this in collaboration with the Jewish community. It's a very unusual way of doing work, I think. We have the leadership of the Jewish community sitting around the table with government on a regular basis, doing what we can to tackle anti-Semitism. It also acts as an early warning system. Any issue that the Jewish community has can easily, very quickly be raised with one telephone call, and you know, you can take things in, you can actually take things forward. Gillian mentioned that this march that's planned for the 4th of July. That's an issue that's obviously been raised with government. We also have our own concerns. Because of the Human Rights Act, we cannot ban the march. That doesn't mean that we aren't in negotiations about if the protest can be moved, and we are in negotiations about it as we speak. But I think government has been very clear that you know, a group of neo-Nazis marching through Golders Green is not ideal, and I'm sure the community of Golders Green can 100% agree with that. But rest assured that we are working on that, and I think the government does agree that the situation is difficult. As Mark said, there's been a record number of anti-Semitic incidents last year. Thankfully, most of those incidents were online, very few of them were violent. It only takes one violent incident. And I think we've been very lucky in the UK thus far, but we haven't actually had incidents like in Paris. That doesn't mean to say, you know, that we are complacent. We always need to remain vigilant.
Can we separate anti-Semitism from anti-Israel political sentiment, and if so, how? Is there a red line between being critical of Israel government policies without being anti-Semitic? And in fact, can one be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? Mark?
You can be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic because Israel is a nation state. So in theory, yes, of course you can, without being racist about it. But nevertheless, that's not how it works. There are ready-made ways of thinking about Jews that seamlessly are employed when people talk in a hostile manner about Israel, because Israel is the Jewish state and that's the way that they think. Sri Lanka did far worse things to the Tamils in 2009, at the time of and beyond Israel's war against the Palestinians at that time. Nobody really cared. Why? Well, because what does Sri Lanka matter to the British consciousness or to European consciousness? It's just irrelevant. People don't even know the religions of the two parties that are involved because it doesn't matter to them. Jews are news. Usually that can work against us. People are fascinated by Jews. This whole anti-Israel thing has anti-Semitic consequences and impacts regardless of the intentions of the people who carry out the actions. If Israel is to be the world's #1 state deserving of boycott, then anyone who supports that state is obviously a moral reprobate, deserving of social isolation, and if on occasion you get a good kicking, then really who cares? Anti-Zionism is something entirely different, I would suggest. Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. The word Jew, Gillian said, the word Jew is replaced by the word Zionist. Yeah? We heard earlier, there was a guy last week said Zionists stole my shoe. He woke up one morning, he couldn't find his shoe, Zionists stole my shoe. Everybody made fun of him. Okay, it's very funny. But 9/11, 4,000 Jews warned not to go to work that day. That's a far bigger conspiracy theory than sneaking into Asghar Bukhari's house and removing his shoe. These anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are widespread, are very deeply believed, and because we are generally rational people, when we hear it expressed by Zionists stole my shoe, we all have a good laugh. When we hear it as 4,000 Jews didn't go to work on 9/11, we fail to appreciate the gravity of what that means, and in particular what it means about the psychology of the huge numbers of people who believe in that, and it's very, very dangerous. I was going to write about this case last week. I never got around to it because I was too busy, because, well, anti-Semitism that we deal with. The anti-Zionist foot fits perfectly into the anti-Semitic slipper. The anti-Semitic slipper is over 2,000 years old. It's very, very well worn. It's a very, very comfortable way of talking about Jews in a hostile manner. Anti-Zionism fits it perfectly. You replace the word Jew with the word Zionist, it's all exactly the same. Jews get others to go to war on their behalf, now Zionists do it. Jews run the media, now Zionists run the media. It's become an empty vessel into which any hatred can be placed. Obviously I could go on for ages and ages. I would love to do so, you get the point.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think we're getting signed, so I'd like to ask Robert and Gillian Nawaz to comment quickly on, and Sally, of course, on just this particular point, and then unfortunately we're going to have to end the session.
Very good question, and very quickly, we have in France a government who is clearly against the policy of the Israeli government. And they say, and this is by no way any sign of anti-Semitism. And when we meet with Laurent Fabius, the foreign minister, he explains that he's for two states and he's against the policy of Netanyahu for what he understands of it. And we can't complain on this government when the president is saying that it's not the Jews that should leave the country by the anti-Semites, when the prime minister says that France without the Jews would not be France anymore. We cannot complain about in any way the French government or the opposition to be anti-Semitic. Now, we just did focus groups to question the French society on what they think. And it appeared very strangely that Zionist has become an insult. That basically they believe, and we're talking the French population in very good faith, that the Muslims are the fundamentalists and the Jews are the Zionists. But both are on an equal path. And this is a discovery, this is very dangerous, and this is why it's obvious that one cannot be anti-Zionist without a feeling of being anti-Semitic.
Thank you. Anybody?
I defer my right to comment because I agree with what's been said and I have nothing further to add for the sake of time.
In that case, thank you very much. Just in closing, one minor comment as a historical buff. I find it is quite symbolic that we are meeting here in the Clement Attlee room, and that for those who are studying Zionism and anti-Zionism, at least some kind of satisfaction that both Mr. Attlee and Mr. Bevan may be turning in their graves today.